I'm Barbara Mead. I'm one of the founders of Politics and Prose, and I came in to introduce Bob Timberg because this is his third time at Politics and Prose. I'm just delighted to have him back.
Maybe I get it right this time.
He was here first for his first book, Nightingale's Song, in 1995. That book was a New York Times Notable Book of the Year, and it was also named by Time Magazine as one of the 5 best nonfiction books of the year. He was here for the second time for State of Grace. That was a book that he wrote about the 2 years that he played sandlot baseball between the time that he was in high school and the time that he football. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. Sorry, I I always need somebody to keep me honest. Um, Sandlot football, but in the 2 years between he spent between high school and going to the Naval Academy, and that book was named one of the best sports books of the year by Sports Illustrated. Tonight, Bob is here to talk about his new memoir, Blue Eye Boy, about his long and painful recovery from severe burns that he sustained in 1967 in Vietnam when he was serving in the Marine Corps. And he was riding in a vehicle, an Amtrak, um, that hit a landmine, blew up it blew up and set on fire the Amtrak, and he was severely burned. It took 35 surgeries under general anesthesia, several more under local anesthesia, and one surgery that would lasted a half hour under no anesthesia at all in his recovery. Um, this book would never have happened if it was by Bob's account, if it had not been for the constant nudging of his son Craig. Craig is here tonight. Craig is a reporter for the Washington Post, and he's an author in his own right of Tinderbox about AIDS and Africa. Um, Actually, Bob has been paid the highest compliment I can imagine for any father. Both of his sons have, two of his sons have followed him into journalism. Um, his actual decision to go into journalism, though, was haphazard at best, as you can hear about this evening. It was at the end of his hospitalizations. He wrote a letter to Wallace Stegner, a great favorite of Politics and Prose, and Wallace Stegner replied and encouraged him to apply to the creative writing program at Stanford, which he did and was accepted. Wallace Stegner was not the only one to encourage Bob's talents as they gradually got more and more on display as his career grew. Early in his career, 2 colleagues at the Baltimore Sun, who were former Nieman Fellows, encouraged him to apply for a Nieman Fellowship, which was against all odds because that there were others at the Baltimore Sun who were applying also. But he applied, and he was one of the dozen fellows who were selected for a year study at Harvard. It was a great honor. And after that, his career just really kind of took off, and he went on for a spectacular 30-year career as an investigative reporter and editor for the Baltimore Sun, including being a White House correspondent. And he was also editor-in-chief of the Naval Institute's magazine Proceedings. And he's had lots of other support along the way. His Baltimore Sun colleagues, Jack Germond and Richard Ben Kramer, and Pat Ferguson, who's head of the Washington Bureau. Pat is a former Marine. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say former Marine. He is a Marine. um, has been very supportive. And if you look at the back of the book, you'll see that two other Marines, Jim Lair and Mark Shields, have wonderful things to say about the book. So the Marines are behind this 100%. And I'm happy to see such a good crowd here tonight to hear Bob talk. And so here he is to give us the whole lowdown on his memoir. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you. It's all downhill from here. I have a sister named Pat. Pat is a speech teacher, and Pat said, "Whatever you do, don't look at notes, don't read, and if you do, people are just going to fall off their chairs." And I thought, if I don't read, I'm going to drop dead. I don't know how to do this. But fortunately, Pat got sick, and she's not here tonight. So, here we go. Hello, is this thing working? It's not. You can? I can talk louder. I'm a Marine, Hi, I'm Bob Timberg. Yeah. I'm here tonight to talk about Blue-Eyed Boy, my memoir about recovering from serious war injuries inflicted by a Viet Cong landmine that left me disfigured and, perhaps more seriously, lost along a life path that once seemed fairly straightforward to me. Very near the end, I was a young Marine officer near the end of my 13-month tour in Vietnam. I had 13 days to go. I had a beautiful wife waiting for me at home, and the future, as they say, was bright until it wasn't. But before I get into that, let me answer the obvious question: why write this book now? I'm a journalist and author who, for nearly half a century now, has struggled not to be defined by a war in a far-off country. It consumed much of my generation, costing the lives of 58,000 men and women. Another 270,000 were wounded. Of the survivors, 21,000 were disabled, of which I was one. But landmine or not, I would not allow, at least I tried not to, I did not want my disabilities to control my future. Yet Vietnam and its aftermath has shaped my life to a degree I never would have imagined possible when I was an ambitious young plebe at the Naval Academy. Pat, wherever you are, look away. Vietnam has shaped my personal life and my work, perhaps most powerfully in my first book, The Nightingale Song, in which I chronicled the story of 5 fellow Naval Academy graduates: John McCain, Oliver North, Jim Webb, John Poindexter, and Bud McFarlane. Chronicled them during their wars and their aftermaths. And while their stories were intended to eliminate those of a generation, or at least that part of the generation that went to war rather than avoiding it, I knew as a journalist that my war and my aftermath was, in fact, very different. I had long told anyone who asked, and a few did over the years, that I would never write my own story. Who needed another book on a wounded Vietnam veteran? Especially one who didn't exactly cover himself with glory as a husband. Pretty good father, but husband, not so good. I didn't see the tale as inspirational or, frankly, anything I wanted to dwell on more than absolutely necessary. Yet as the years went by, I began to sense that our nation had returned to a familiar place, with deep divisions over unpopular wars and thousands of men and women bearing the scars of those conflicts to a terribly unfair degree. After a long career, I began to appreciate that my that my story echoed their stories and might help illuminate the true cost of combat to a nation that sometimes enters its wars a bit carelessly. My greater hope, though, is that the tale I've told in this book will show that with some courage and some luck and some good people around you, those who are paid for our more recent military adventures with their arms or their legs or their skin might regain some of what they lost while serving their country. Blue-Eyed Boy is not so much a story of the wounds I received one day in 1967 or the surgeries that followed over the next 5 years to repair third-degree burns to my face and arms. This memoir is about recovery and reclamation. In this journey, I had extraordinary help from people who loved me. First among them was my first wife, and who was crucial, who I thought would be here tonight, but is not, as I can see. No. She must have been talking to my sister. But my first wife was crucial to my coming out on the other end of what was a seemingly endless nightmare. There was also the work of a dedicated and talented surgeon named Lynn Ketchum, who over the course of some 35 operations, both as a Navy doctor and in private practice, reconstructed my face. There were also got one lousy paragraph to go. I mean, I got to get through this. There were also lonely moments, demoralizing moments, terrifying moments that were all my own. Truth be told, there still are. Yet Blue-Eyed Boy is about how I gradually found my way back onto my life's path. Maybe not the exact one I was on before my injuries, but one that, in the end, feels authentically my own. So, we happen to answer any questions, but if we have time, do I have time to read some? I actually have two selections, and we may only get through one. And this one is, one is sort of hopeful, and one is like telling you what it was like. And I think I'm going to do the latter for the moment. I had been wounded. I had been bounced into hospitals in Da Nang, and I can't even remember where, but I finally wound up at Clark Air Base in the Philippines. And I was still, basically I was there because they figured out I was going to live. So they were going to get me home by way of Clark and Japan and everywhere. But at any rate, that's what I was at Clark Air Base, and I was still bandaged to the point that I looked like a mummy. Yeah. At any rate, on my second, all the nurses were really good. They sort of helped me, but not all of them. Not all the nurses were that congenial. At Clark, which was a permanent hospital and far from the action, a familiar kind of stateside officiousness set in. It was generally not unkind, but frequently was detached. I could hear doctors and nurses zipping past, usually in a rush to keep up with the wartime pace of casualties. It seemed at times that we patients were no more than parts on an assembly line, broken pieces of Marine Corps fighting machines that had to be put back together. On my second day at Clark, I overheard one of the nurses. She was new, or in any case, I didn't recognize her voice, but I heard the words, "Where's the burn?" For a split second, I wondered myself, the burn? What burn? Then, in a flash of revelation as swift and brutal as the one delivered by the landmine itself, I knew what she meant. I should have been angry, but I wasn't. I was gripped by fright, stripped of the faux cockiness that had helped me through the previous 2 weeks. The web of defense mechanisms I had subconsciously constructed to protect myself against the reality of my situation. They had been swept away in a little more than a second as I realized the burn was me. With two short words, the nurse stripped me of both my identity and my humanity, revealing me as a piece of meat, and charred meat at that. No longer was I Bob Timberg or Janie's husband or my parents' kid. I was now the burn, not just in the eyes of some members of the nursing staff at Clark, but in my own bleary, goopy eyes as well. The reality of a serious wounding, like my encounter with the VC landmine, does not take hold all at once. There is the explosion and an initial pain and the confusion. By then, of course, the physical damage has been done, and in my case, that loss alone would stay with me forever. But it's the dawning awareness, delivered in a kind of drip, drip, drip water torture of revelation that gradually lands an equally vicious psychic blow. And this too would stay with me forever. If I wasn't the trim, hard-charging young Marine officer, the man who worked himself out of the chaos of a troubled family, who found a gorgeous bride who was ready to fight and kill for the ideals of his nation, who was I? I didn't know anymore. At the end of the second day at Clark, I felt strong arms beneath my body as I was again trundled from hospital to aircraft. I was told Japan was my next stop. As I was being settled in the plane, one of my handlers, a woman I couldn't see, remarked with an audible sneer, "You must really love all this attention." The remark stunned me, as if I had gotten myself burned nearly to death merely to experience the tender mercies of military medicine. I felt like I had been spit on. Beneath my bandages, I seethed at the insult, but did not react, could not react with the fury I felt. Bob Timberg would have erupted, somehow made the woman regret her words, reduced her to effing tears. The burn just lay there, uncomplaining, a pathetic slab of helpless protoplasm. It's the end of that section. I don't know, we want to cheer for that, right? So I'm done, right? You know, I could read a little more, but if... Okay, but when it gets to the point where it's like boring, we got to put hands up, or you know, in the Naval Academy, you know, it was really, my friend Charity, she went to Air Force Academy. It may have been like that too, and so the two people on the side of her, and they've all bounced around Iraq as well. So, but what we did at the Naval Academy when we were being bored to death, if you fell asleep at your desk, you were put on report. But if you got up, walked to the back of the room, and stood in the back of the room, it was okay. I mean, it was understood. And so we did a lot of that. I in fact did that once and then walked in my sleep and knocked down a slide projector. But that was the best I could do. At any rate, how did I get into this? Oh, yeah, if any of you get up, I am going to stop because I can't deal with the idea that I'm boring the hell out of somebody the way people used to bore the hell out of me at the Naval Academy. So, okay, all right. I'm now, after all that stuff that we just read, I went to Stanford. I sort of learned a little about journalism, and I somehow got a job. And my first job was at the Annapolis Evening Capital, where I had gone to school. When someone asked me, "Hey, what about the Annapolis Evening Capital as a job?" I said, "What is it?" They said, it's a newspaper. I said, oh, right? A newspaper in a place I had just spent 4 years, right? Okay, here we go. Timberg, some woman is shouting about throwing herself the Eastport Bridge, said Mike Lewis, the bespectacled city editor, in the clipped phrasing he seemed to employ for everything from scoldings to the all-too-frequent pleasantry. He slammed down the phone as he spoke. The newsroom chatter ceased. I looked up from my desk. Mike was staring at me. As his stare morphed into what seemed like a glare, I wondered if he was trying to tell me something. He was. Go, he snapped. Second day on the job, first story. I pulled my jacket and from the back of a wooden swivel chair, stuffed a reporter's notebook into my breast pocket, slapped my pants pocket to make sure I had a pen, and scrambled down the stairs from our second-floor office into a frigid January day. I'm going to skip a little bit and get me down to the Eastport Bridge, where supposedly this lady was threatening to jump. I was not in good shape. My legs had turned to rubber because I had been running. My lungs burned, and I was wheezing heavily as I staggered up to the nearest policeman. Sir, you'll have to stand over there, he said, gesturing to the crowd behind a police line. I raised my hand and waved them back and forth, palms forward, signaling, I hoped, that I was not just another curious bystander and that I would explain my presence as soon as I caught my breath. Eve, Cap, I gasped, pulling out my notebook. You with a crab wrapper? Said the cop, not unkindly, but in a tone of disbelief. I answered with a series of nods while struggling to catch my breath. You're a little late, he said, giving me what I took to be a self-satisfied smile. It's all over. I turned toward the bridge. Police, firefighters, and medical personnel scurried about, and there was plenty of activity, but alas, no sense of urgency. It was indeed over. A knot began forming in my stomach. I had blown my first story. Or had I? A light went on. Reporters rarely are present at the scene of the action while it's occurring and almost always need to reconstruct it by interviewing witnesses. Sure, I hadn't seen the action, but several dozen onlookers had, in addition to the cops and other emergency personnel. I do need to add in here that this whole idea of me becoming a journalist was suggested by my wife, and I thought it was the dumbest idea in the world because I was never, ever going to go out in public again. And when I did, it was a disaster. Little kids would say, hey, Mommy, look at that man. And I would, become very hostile, as only Marines can be, and would say, hey, dickhead, how about teaching your kid not to stare? It was like very unpleasant. So that was my life. I didn't go out, but somehow I become a stupid journalist because I don't know how I've done it, but I have. But I'm no less comfortable out in public, none. So at any rate, so here I am down there, and all these people are standing around, all these people who have never seen me before, and okay, a light went on. Reporters are rarely present. I hadn't seen the action, but several dozen of onlookers had. Turning back to the officers, I said, "What happened?" "I'm not authorized to talk to the press," he said, directing me to an officer on the bridge who seemed to be in charge. "Look, officer, this is my first day on the job. I just need a little help. I won't quote you in the paper. Just give me some idea of what's going on so I don't look like an idiot when I start asking questions." A short silence ensued. Then he said, "This lady dove off the bridge. They just fished her out." A short silence ensued. Then I said, "Is she dead?" "I don't think so," said the cop. "I don't know." "That's all you get from me. Good luck." They say a little knowledge can be a dangerous thing. True, but as I was to learn in the years ahead, A strand of information can be enough to unravel the most amazing tales if you tug on it skillfully enough. Over the next hour, armed only with the general outline of events, I fleshed out the story. I did it by talking to everything that moved, onlookers as well as officials, opening each encounter by saying, "Hi, I'm Bob Timberg from the Evening Capital. Can you tell me what happened?" Most of the people I spoke to reacted to my scars, usually with startled expressions of the sort that in other circumstances might have triggered a hostile response from me. Not now. I didn't care how spooked they looked when I first approached them. I just wanted them to tell me what they had seen and heard. A couple of impatient cops in a police vehicle started to pull away before I was done questioning them. I pulled open the rear door, poked my head in, and said, "Hey, I've got a few more questions. How about I ride along with you?" Before they could say no, I was in the back seat, pen poised, notebook at the ready. The cops looked at me like they wanted to shoot me. Instead, they drove me back to the paper, answering questions along the way. I like to think they admired my chutzpah, but they probably were taking the path of least resistance. The next day, the off-lead story on the front page of the Evening Capital carried the two-deck headline, "After pacing Eastport Bridge, woman plunges to icy death in Spa Creek." It began, "A 50-year-old Annapolis woman leaped to her death from the Eastport Bridge shortly after noon yesterday, seconds before a city police officer could reach her. Alerted by a passing motorist who reported the woman acting suspiciously, Officer Sidney Diggs rushed to the scene and was stopping his car as Mrs. Lovey G. Lindsay of 78 Clay Street plunged through the thin ice covering Spa Creek. She saw me," Diggs said, "but by the time I got my car stopped, she jumped." The story ran with a dramatic photo by staff photographer Joe Groover showing rescue equipment lifting Mrs. Lindsay's lifeless body from the creek. Missing from the story was a byline. Tradition held that a cub reporter, even one with a war under his belt and approaching his 30th birthday, has to earn his byline, and he can't do it with one story, no matter how good it was. I had no problem with that. Whether my name was on it or not, I knew it was my story, and I know I had gotten it right. Only later did I realize that Mrs. Lindsay's watery demise marked the start of my transition from victim to something else. I wasn't sure what. I was sure, though, of a fascinating phenomenon. From the moment Mike Lewis chased me out of the newsroom until I returned to my desk and turned in my story, I had no sense of being disfigured. Took up too much time, right? Anybody have any questions? Marie. Oh, you have to go to, oh, I forgot. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, just I know that we're very conscious now of severely wounded veterans and PTSD, but a lot of that was not first and foremost in the Vietnam War, plus it was a very unpopular war as well. Could you talk a bit about your impressions in addition to being badly wounded, about the atmosphere when you came back?
The thing that interested me most in that period was my generation. Mm-hmm. And my generation was consisted of those who went and those who didn't. And those who didn't, many had very, very solid reasons not to go. They had physical disabilities, they had emotional issues, but some of them also just had good lawyers and friendly doctors. And to me, if that's how you were avoiding the draft and you were watching the kid next door march off to war, you were not a person that I could ever admire and would never do anything to save. But, it was, people use money, wit, and connections, as I thought of it, to avoid service in Vietnam. And if that's how it was, fine. They had to live with it. We had to live with it. What did I think they should have done? I don't think you should go to war if you think it's an immoral war. But there was this one guy who happened to be Joan Baez's husband, named David Harris, who was a schoolmate of mine at Stanford, though I never knew him. But David started a program, organization called Resistance. And what David did is he said, look, this is a horrible war. We should not be in it. And I don't want to be part of it. But, so if you're going to try and make me part of it, you're going to have to arrest me and put me in jail. And they did. But, and David said others should do it as well. Well, not that many others did it at all. Some did, though, for sure. See, the reason the Vietnam War could continue for so long is because there weren't too many middle-class kids involved in it. LBJ never called up the reserves. Why? Because middle-class kids whose fathers could scream bloody murder and make themselves heard in the halls of Congress, where their parents, they didn't have to go. But if he had called up the reserves, and suddenly you had middle class kids, going to war, and you had middle class kids who being drafted because their friendly doctors' excuses were being blown away, I think it would have been a different war. And I frankly, I'm frankly too much of a reporter to really. I don't think I hold grudges. I understand grudges, but I don't hold grudges. But I remember a friend of mine, he actually wasn't a friend, of someone I interviewed when I was writing the Nightingale song, and he was a guy who had an army soldier who had last rites, he told me, 7 times. But what he said was, there's a wall 5 miles high and 50 miles thick between those of us who went and those who didn't, and that wall is never going to come down. And I generally think that that's a little too strong, and sometimes I think it's right on.
If I could just ask a follow-up that's been prompted, because now we've had the longest wars ever in our history with an all-volunteer army, which skirts the issue of the draft. So what's your feeling about the all-volunteer army?
I really don't believe in doing away with the draft. And you don't draft kids. You don't find middle class kids in there, and you allow a president effectively freedom to do whatever he wants with the armed forces, because hey, they all volunteered. So that's what I think. I don't believe in the abolition of selective service. I don't think it did anything of value for us, and I think it did some things that have become very difficult for us to deal with.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Did you use archival materials in reconstructing your time in Vietnam? And if you did you discover elements of your experience that were a surprise to you?
I didn't use much in the way of archival material. I used mostly what I remembered. I did a couple of things, and it was on minor points, and none of it was really. I don't think any of it was a surprise to me.
I love this book, The Nightingale Song, and
Thank
I
you.
want you to know that in the book club that I have belonged to for probably 20 years now, all women, this is probably our favorite book.
Really?
Over the course of a number of years, this has really always been an incredibly special book to us.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask you a question that compares.
Not going to be a hard question now, right?
I don't know.
I mean, as a
I
reporter,
think
that's
you
what
can
you do.
answer
You
it.
sort of set somebody up, right? Isn't that right, Craig? You just say, "Oh yeah, you're such a good guy." Oh yeah, by the way, did you kill that person?
I don't think this will be a hard question, but I
good.
think it might give you a chance to expand a little bit on some of the points that you made in this really wonderful book. And that is, in this book you talk so much about the cultural divide that existed in the United States in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And I'm wondering, as I look at the political landscape today in this country, do you think the cultural divide has gotten worse? Do you think some of the political rhetoric, some of the feelings that are experienced with the divisions within the parties and within our political landscape are stronger now than they were then? I'm interested in your perspective on the comparison.
I feel like within Congress, it's meaner. It's more mean-spirited. And there doesn't seem to be anything of value coming out of it. But I still think we're a long way from the 60s, when families were split, where kids were running off to other countries, where fathers and sons and daughters didn't talk. I don't think, and I pray, to the extent I still pray, that we never have an atmosphere in this country similar to what we had in the 1960s. At the same time, I hope that I would like to think that no serious politician today would stand up and say something like, our job is to make sure that this guy never gets reelected.
Right,
As I've heard somebody say, he said, but who the hell knows, right?
right.
It just seems to be so mean-spirited. And I don't feel good about politics right now, and I used to cover them, and I used to love it. And I didn't mind if people did stupid things, or there's so much meanness right now.
And to what end? You always keep asking to
Yeah,
what end.
yeah.
Right. And then just one quick follow-up, if I may. Two of the remarkable men that you discussed in this book, John McCain and, Jim Webb is no longer in the Senate. But I just wondered if you keep up with them, if you still see them.
I've talked with Jim several times.
Have you?
And with Senator McCain,
Yes.
I haven't, because, I haven't had any real reason to, but I really would like to not have to have a conversation with him about certain things that he did. I never could believe that John McCain selected Sarah Palin as his running mate. And it's not that I think that she's not a capable woman. I just don't think that anybody that had the experience she had at that time, that I wanted being a heartbeat away from the president, a president who had serious cancer surgery, and as might be the person who decides to send my son or your son or my grandson to war. I couldn't believe John McCain, who understood this stuff better than almost anyone, did that. But he did. And, frankly, he may have had a great reason, and I have the greatest respect for John McCain. But boy, that was...
It's a tough one. Thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks again for this book.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Hi, Bob.
Hi, Marie.
I want to add that we're in the same book club. I told you I was waiting for my friend. And you were supposed to come, and I believe you got sick. We actually invited you to come speak, but we'll talk about that later. Maybe the next time for this book we can get
Maybe somebody who really didn't want me to speak made that story up.
I don't know.
Because I don't recall that ever happening.
Okay, well, for the past 9 years, I've worked for 2 nonprofits that help injured service members and their families at Walter Reed and Bethesda Naval Hospital. And it just stopped, but I wanted to know, have you been back to Bethesda? Now Walter Reed, of course, moved to the Bethesda Naval. They merged, I should say. Did you ever go back? Did you ever talk to any of the service members injured in Iraq and Afghanistan?
I was in the hospital with some of them. But I did not have any extended
Right.
conversations.
And of course, it's so striking the difference in the medicine today, where 1 in 4 who died, 1 in 4 injured in Vietnam, right, died, and 1 in 8 now, and with
Yeah.
prosthetic
But
limbs.
yeah, I know the prosthetics are amazing.
Right, right.
But, you know, it was the same. Vietnam was such a step forward from Korea
Right.
and World War II.
Right. So I just thought that people would really be interested in your story and your experience, and, you know, I was just wondering if you had talked to any of the injured
Yeah,
service
but I
members
didn't, you
there.
know, as I noted, I don't talk about this stuff.
Okay.
Except now I seem to have spilled my guts about it, right?
Aw, okay.
But
thank
back then I didn't.
As I say, thank
Before I
you for your
became
service.
what I've now become, right?
Thank
Right.
you.
Okay, Marie. Anybody else?
One quick question on the 2 books that you've written. I understand, like Dick Cheney being so pro-war with his deferments, he never saw the horror of it. McCain, I've never understood how somebody who saw the horrors of it like he did is always so pro-war every time something comes up. I mean, based on what you know about him and the research you've done, what's the psychology of that? I could never
I
understand
think,
it.
you know, I may not agree with John McCain, but I never question his motives or what he thinks is that he thinks is the right thing to do. It may be anything but the right thing to do, but he doesn't fake that stuff. I mean, what you hear is authentic John McCain and what he believes. And, you know, frankly, as anybody has earned the right to a few mistakes John McCain has. You know.
Got time for one more question here.
Barbara, I also want to ask a question.
Get ready.
This is George Williams, my son Sam's
A little tall for the mic, so I had to bend down.
classmate and baseball team
That's all right.
teammate.
Let's see. Mr. Timberg, as I'll always call you. I've known you my whole life. Coach. My whole life, most of my life. And Sam, your son, is my best friend. And, you know, I grew up knowing you, and you said in your book, when you were mentioning the baseball team, that no one ever really asked you anything or looked at you weird or strange. And I didn't. And it's because I grew up knowing you like that. As I got a little older, I kind of wondered about your story. And I finally got a glimpse into it through State of Grace, when you started talking about, you talked about your childhood. And I was finding out about my best friend's father. And with that book ending with you on the ship, I had this like romantic view of you on the ship waving goodbye to Janie. And I was like, oh man, I just really wanted to hear the rest. And
You know what they say? Be careful what you wish
yes,
for.
well, I wanted to stand up and first I'll say thank you very much for letting it all out. And I can't understand, but I imagine that's been terribly difficult. I know that doing this right now is terribly difficult, but I'll tell you, thank you so much. I do think that you're a hero. I think that you're a hero today for writing this and standing up and talking about it and letting us all hear what you've been through and what you've learned from it. So thank you very much for everything you've done. I'll ask you some questions later.
George, that was so nice. I'm going to resist a closing wisecrack. Thank you.
That was a good one.
Okay. I'm done. All right. Thank you.